The core argument of this book is that the truth matters because it affects how we live our lives. It seeks to take this fact, which is so often intuited, and make it explicit. The truth accords with fact or reality, and so the truth matters because the more we come to understand it, the better equipped we are to deal with reality as it is. That is the primary point of this book. Yet we also find that this simple claim has many implications. If we take what is right in front of us, the fact of life and our need to live it, we can move soundly and directly onto many conclusions about truth and our relation to it. Hence, this is the sum of this book, to establish the nature and importance of truth before branching out from this argument into many insights that walk within its orbit. This book is an exercise in first philosophy, or foundational philosophy. Of all of the ways to start a philosophical inquiry, it chooses to start with life and our need to live it. From there, it proves the importance of truth for life. It also improves the existence of will and the capacity to understand. It explains the role of our intentions and our reason. And beyond that, it establishes the existence of cosmic, ordering principles of reality. With all of this in hand, one could draw a direct connection between the existence of life, through our interactions with it, to the nature of reality as such. Therefore, this book lays a philosophical foundation which is at once immediate, basic, and far-reaching. And so those are the first few chapters of my new book. I say new, it's actually been out for a few months now, but as many of you know, I've not really been around for a while. My apologies. Should I say apologies? Do I have anything to apologise for? No, so I take that back. But just to explain, I simply haven't been around for a while because I've been busy with various things. I've been moving around quite a lot. I've had to shift and focus on different types of work. And so I haven't really had the chance to do a podcast in a while, but I hope now I can get back and do them more regularly again. Anyway, one of the things I was able to achieve was this book, and the title is Life and Truth: How Reality Shapes What We Do by Tony V.C. Lowe. It's on Amazon, and it's in both the paperback and the Kindle format. And like with all of my books, I sell it for the price of which it takes to distribute it. So they're never technically free, but I try to make them as cheap and affordable as possible. I don't really expect to make any money out of my books. But yeah, I want to spend this episode just telling you a little bit about what the book is all about. Because I would say in many ways, my first interest is philosophy in one shape or another. And for me, when I first came to kind of interact with philosophy, it always struck me as being fundamentally the pursuit of truth. Trying to find out what is true as compared to what is false. And I mean, fortunately, when I started my philosophical education in college, not in the American sense, not university, but like college would be, I think, high school for the Americans. We did epistemology to begin with, and these were important questions about, how do we know the things that we know, and how do we realize what justifies a belief compared to what doesn't, and that kind of stuff. I'm not going to say that every thinker we dealt with or every question was sensible, but the general approach seemed to be in the real spirit of philosophy for me. What is true? And then when I got to university, it seemed that overall question took a kind of back step, and we were more interested in things like politics and sex, of all things, and the way that we shape and culture and language and how this stuff affects us, and the way that we have our tastes and opinions and all this kind of thing. And basically the idea of there being like an objective truth seemed to be kind of stripped back and at least fractured. You'd have some philosophers who kind of agreed with the idea of objective truth, but couldn't really use that idea to pull any weight. And then there would just be everyone else who kind of would consent to the idea of objective truth when it suited them, and then just get rid of it in any other domain where it didn't. The thing is, I always have this intuitive understanding that truth not only exists, but it matters profoundly. And there were two questions I came across during those days, which, as crazy as they sound, maybe they'll sound crazy to some of you, they did genuinely stump me. The first question was, how exactly do we know that truth is objective? And one of the questions that branched off from that was, if, for example, we say that logic is important, or the use of reason, why? Right? What justifies the use of logic, for example? And the second question was, even if you could give an answer to that question, even if you could prove that truth exists, that it's objective, and that we can interact with it using our reason, why should we care? Right? And that question stumped me as well. I mean, in a certain sense, it's very obvious. It's so obvious that I suppose that every philosopher until now, well, I don't know if that's exactly true, but most people, whether they be philosophers or the general public, kind of recognize that truth does have some consequence, some significance for what? And I suppose that was the question. So with all of that kind of giving you a backdrop, I knew the answers to these questions a couple of years ago, basically. I mean, these answers were in utero. I knew the fundamental principles, but I didn't know how to put them all in a straight line and to make all of the relevant connections. I basically realized that you can't function properly in life unless you have a relationship with truth. And whether that relationship is explicit or not. Because at the end of the day, reality is what it is, And at the end of the day, someone can say all they want that reality doesn't exist or it's merely a matter of opinion, but at a very practical level, a punch in the face is a punch in the face. And no matter how much you change your opinion about that, it still hurts, You can't imagine a way or define away the need to eat food, for example. I mean, you can give food whatever definition you want, but at the end of the day, if you do that, it still means you're going to starve, right? And so there was a baseline kind of criteria for reality, what we'd call kind of practical consequences of it. And so that, for me, always seemed like a very obvious proof of the relationship between truth and practicality, basically. And then I eventually, luckily, amazingly, after university, discovered, Aristotle's laws of thought and not only the fact that logic was foundational, but the reasons for why it was foundational for our relationship with truth and our ability to understand and perceive truth clearly, or at least distinguish it from falsehood. Not perfectly, but I deal with that in the book. But still, we had these kind of basic criteria. So, in a nutshell, it's all about reclaiming the fact, or at least making the fact that truth is important explicit. Because despite the fact that it may, the importance or relevance of truth would have been obvious for most people throughout history, it's not obvious now. It's just not. Again, the existence of truth is one thing, but even the importance of asking the question is not properly understood. And so that's why I was interested in exploring this, right? If you like, connecting, not only exploring the logos of philosophy, like the pursuit of truth, but the ethos as well. Because, to be fair, and I suppose would include myself in this crowd of people, most philosophers or most people who believe in pursuing truth simply intuit its value for its own sake, right? In that sense, they kind of simply have faith in the value and the nature of truth, but without an explicit understanding of why it's actually relevant, especially why it's relevant for life, And so that's what this book is trying to do. This book is basically an explication of the painfully obvious. And it's, I suppose, in some ways, it's going to be not only an explication of the painfully obvious, but perhaps for some a painful explication of that as well, because I must admit, it's not written to be rhetorical in any way. Allow me to explain that for a second. This is quite a dry book. Life and Truth is a dry book, and I'm the first one to admit that. Some people find it, a few people have read it already. Some of them have found it quite easy to read, some of them not. But it's very much, I've very much approached it in the way that I would approach, say, like a maths equation. One of the ways I've tried to kind of picture it in my head is like this. When you make a car that you want someone to drive, that you want someone to enjoy, then obviously a part of that is making the car aesthetic, right? You want it to look good, you want it to be comfortable to sit in and all that kind of stuff, and make it enjoyable for the person to actually interact with. Great. But before that, you need to actually make sure the engineering is correct, right? You need to make sure all the parts are in the right place, that the engine functions, and so on. And so in a sense, you want to do the math before you actually make the damn thing and before you actually put it to use. In the Trivium, for example, we would say this is where you want to do the logic before you do the rhetoric. And I really, in an ideal world, I would have been able to write this book with the logic and a bit more. I'm no rhetorician, but I'd have a bit more rhetorical flair to kind of add some flavor to the arguments, but no. I found that first I had to simply do the dialectical and simply write the logic. And then after that, in the future, what I'm hoping to do now is I really needed to process these arguments for myself explicitly so that they kind of create a foundation or a framework. And now, if I write any topics that extend from this in the future, basically any topic about philosophy, whether it be ontological, epistemological, or ethical, so any studies about truth or knowledge or ethics or whatever. If I do any of those, I can now draw upon this work with the confidence that the logic has kind of been straightened out. And then I feel I'm going to have a bit more freedom to just speak a bit more, what would you say? A bit more colourfully, I suppose, or a little bit more relaxed now that I know that the foundation's set. So anyway, what am I even telling you? I'm telling you that this book is about the foundations of our interactions with truth. I would say our interactions with philosophy, because that's what it should be. But, I don't see the pursuit of truth as something relegated to philosophers. Far from it. In fact, one of the things I try to explain in this book is that truth is relevant for everyone. Every single living being. It's relevant for everyone because, again, it's our marker or our compass or our map, if you like, of reality. And obviously, if we're trying to navigate reality in life, that is what we're trying to do when we're making our decisions, when we're trying to decide what's better, what's worse. Should we go left? Should we go right? Should I be a doctor? Should I be a soldier? All of these things depend on what reality is and how we function and can function within it, right? All of it. And so I'm trying to just tie that significance back to the whole question of truth. Because as I was trying to say, a lot of philosophers will intuit the value of truth inherently, but then when they go to advocate for objective truth, and someone asks them, okay, so you guys are arguing for the existence of objective truth, and maybe you can prove it, but why should I care, right? And I think part of that is the fact that people intuitively know that if truth with a capital T does in fact exist, it either creates certain responsibilities or demands, or it at least creates certain restraints, the nature of which people are uncomfortable to admit. Okay. If 2 + 2 = 4 and does not equal 5, then you can cut a 5-meter plank of wood and it will not fit within a 4-meter gap, right? It's a trivial example, but you know exactly what I mean. And so thought what something like this could be useful for is really just, again, clarifying the obvious, right? We all know intuitively that truth matters, but why exactly does it matter? If we were pressed to give a defense of that, then what would that defense, or what could that defense be? And I suppose at a very basic level, even if we were talking across the board, religious, secular alike, it matters because if you care about living life, then you need to care about truth. If you care about making choices, you need to care about making truth. If you don't care about making choices, who cares anyway, right? Why is such a person even worth having a conversation with? Because if they don't care about making choices, then the whole idea of anything being better or worse, good or bad, true or false, is utterly irrelevant, right? Utterly. And so that's kind of the main idea. So what I've done with the book is I've split it into two main sections, right? Part 1 and part 2. Because what I wanted to do is I wanted just to kind of... By the way, I should mention, the book is very short. It's only about 80 pages, so you could probably read the whole thing in like 2 hours. But I've tried to make it very concise and very just straightforward. So part 1 is simply the foundational argument of the book. So what I do is I move through 3 stages of argument. Firstly, I establish... Well, actually, the very first thing I do is give a whole list of definitions, okay, taken from the Oxford Dictionary, just so everyone knows what I mean with the terms I'm using. And then if you might say, oh, but then how do we know that language is relevant for truth? Well, I cover that in part 2. But so if that really bugs you, you can jump ahead, read that, and then jump back. But I'll give the definitions that I'm going to work with, and then I move through part 1 to actually make the foundational argument. So that starts with the relationship between life and truth, right? What is truth, and why does it matter for our ability to live life? And then what occurred to me was the fact that you can actually go from that relationship. You know, you can quite quickly and logically prove the relationship between truth and life and the importance. And then you can actually infer directly, well, I suppose you deduce, actually, yeah, you can logically deduce a number of key facts from that, right? A number of key truths. And it's actually 3 pairs of relationships that the foundational part looks at. The first relationship is the relationship between life and truth. The second relationship is the relationship between the will and our understanding, as you might call it, or the mind. Because as it turns out, you know, if you accept the fact, if you follow the logic and accept the fact that we need to understand truth in order to choose properly, then even from that and the relevance of truth to our desire and need to live life properly, then you directly infer from that therefore we are beings that have a reason, the faculty of reason, and the will, right, the faculty of choice. Now again, as I already told you, this book is all about explaining the obvious. But here's one thing that I thought might be a little bit more fruitful. Okay, so you go from life and truth to the will and reason, and then there's one other facet which I think is important. Basically, if we can will and if we can reason, then it means that there are higher realities that we are interacting with when we do both of those things. Now, I'm not going to explain all that here, but that is explained clearly, I believe, in the book. If we can only navigate, for example, if we can only navigate reality in a particular way because reality itself is a particular way, and if we can only fundamentally interact with that if we're following reason, there's some caveats, don't worry, but if our reason, say, can recognize what reality is like, then it must mean that reality itself is so ordered that it has a rational nature, right? That's the idea. And so what we can then conclude is simply from that fact, we can then conclude that there is an overarching rational character or order to reality, which we would call logos. And then there's also a purposive order that directly relates to that, which we call telos. And so, basically, first part is life and truth, the will and the mind, and then telos and logos. And it tracks the kind of mutual relationships between all of those things in a logical progression. And so, to my mind, that sets the foundation for everything else we need to talk about as we move forward. What is truth? How does it basically function? How does it relate to our will and our reason? And therefore, what are the overarching principles of reality? So that's part 1. But, obviously, there's always more to be said. And on this particular topic, there is so much to be said because as kind of minute, if you like, or specific as it may be, it has direct relational consequences to just everything. Just so many things. And even within the argument itself, there were many things that were like immediately relevant to that, at least from what I could see. And so instead of getting lost in all of these tangents in part one, because again, I wanted to be concise, I decided to move them over to part two. Okay, so part two is basically a collection of like mini essays which directly follow on from, they do one of two things. Either they follow on directly from the arguments of part one and kind of say, well, if part one is true, or the arguments therein are true, then this must be a consequence of it, which is still relevant in some way. Or it explains some argument of some part of part one that might have been left wanting. For example, two of the explanation chapters, one is about language. If I'm using language, in this, especially definitions, to make the argument in part one, how could I do that if we're doing first philosophy, right? Because if you think about it, if I was doing first philosophy, then I'd have to explain the validity of language before I then use language to make the argument, blah, 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 blah. But, that's kind of dealt with. So that's one that explains something that wasn't explained in part one. And then another chapter, which is a follow-on, is, you can use the arguments in chapter one to logically prove the relationship between morality and reason, for example. A lot of philosophers in the past have always insisted that there is a kind of direct relationship between what we conclude to be ethical by power of reason, and therefore it creating a kind of moral onus upon us. So I try to kind of give something to that relationship in one of those chapters, in that chapter in part two. But there's a bunch of other chapters as well that can explain a whole plethora of different things. Is there anything else I need to explain for now? No, because that's basically it. Okay, that's the whole idea of life and truth. It's about, again, setting up that relationship, that foundation. And then I do plan to move beyond this or work upon this in the future. Right? I've got one book I'm already thinking of writing. I'm already planning to write, which will jump over or jump upon a lot of these arguments to actually then speak more directly to the whole problem of truth in the world in which we currently live. Because it's the modern mentality is so deranged that it's not only, it's first burnt its way through objective Christianity, and then it's burnt its way through subjective Christianity, then it's burnt its way through Western culture in general, and it's gone through the humanities. It's just cut its way through all of these things, all of these foundational pillars that we've had, even as they've been weakened. It first weakens and then it chops them down. And it's got so far along in that progression that it's trying to cut through the very existence of truth itself. And so there's such a pushback to make against that. And there are so many ways to do it and so many things to say on that. But I think life and truth, at least for me, was somewhere to start. And so for any of you who are interested in these same kind of topics, I hope at least it could be of some interest and maybe have something that could be of use. That'll be all for today. God bless you all.